We are now going to do the clean finish seam finish. This one takes the most time to prep, but looks the cleanest and most professional from the inside. Again, we are starting from a plain seam. To do this one, you are going to take your seam allowance and you are actually going to go to the iron and press it in half, just the seam allowance, so that you are pressing it down. So you'll press this in half so it's going to look like this. Once we do that, we're going to come back and stitch down the middle of this seam allowance. This is going to tuck our raw edge underneath and sew it into place so that we have a nice clean finish on the outside. I have now pressed the seam allowance in half with it being pressed towards the bottom. I'm going to come and move the material out from underneath. Remember, we only apply the seam finishes to the actual seam allowance. Because I folded it in half, we have two things that we are stitching together, so I am going to do a back stitch. I want to sew straight down the center of this seam allowance, so I'm not going to line up my foot with anything. I'm just going to make sure that I'm stitching down the center. I'm going to go ahead and back stitch. A couple stitches will be just fine. Then I'm going to keep my stitching straight down that seam allowance. What this stitching is doing is holding that fold into place. When I get to the end, I am also going to back stitch. When you are done, lift up the presser foot, trim, and you'll see that I have one stitch down the center. If I open up my material, you will see that this is half the size of our original seam allowance because I folded it in half and now have stitched down the center. This is a clean fold compared to our raw edge. We will do the clean edge finish on both sides, which will get rid of the raw edge and make a nice clean finish for the inside of our garment. I have now pressed the other seam allowance in half, so it's underneath. I'm going to stitch only the seam allowance. Remember, nothing goes to the front of the material. I'm going to come and back stitch. Keeping your stitch in the center of the seam allowance that you folded is important. It's going to make your stitch look much cleaner. Once you get to the end, you'll back stitch again to hold it into place. Once you are done, your clean finish will look like this. No raw edges are visible because we have them tucked underneath, and you have a nice edge stitch to hold it down.